This is Lecture 10, the Auditory System, and it corresponds to Chapter 10 of your textbook.
Okay, so starting on Section 1, Sound Waves. Throughout this chapter, I'm going to be going back and forth a lot between language and music, just like your book. Language and music processing have a lot of similarities. Most of language functions are on the left side of the brain. Most of music functions are on the right side of the brain, and they use a lot of the same areas, just on opposite sides of the brain. Before we get into sound processing in the brain, a quick primer on sound waves. So sound waves are waves of changing pressure moving through a medium, which is typically air, and this propagates the sound, these waves of pressure. There are three physical properties of sound waves, that's frequency, amplitude, and complexity, and the auditory system codes each of these properties individually. Frequency is the first property of sound, and this is the number of cycles of a sound wave within a given period of time. One cycle is one peak and one trough within like a sine wave. So hertz is the way that we typically express frequency, and this is the number of cycles in a second. And higher pitch sounds have higher hertz values, which means more cycles per second. Lower pitch sounds have fewer cycles per second. And if you want to connect that to the different frequencies to actual sounds, you can follow this link. I recommend that. It's like a tone generator. It's going to tell you the frequencies of the tones you're hearing. Interestingly, if you have ever heard two musicians trying to tune or trying to match pitch, play the same pitch, what they're doing is trying to play tones with the exact same frequency. So if you look at this image in the middle with the blue and red sine waves or sound waves, these are two musicians that are out of tune on the top one. So the red musician is playing a slightly lower pitch. It's a slightly longer sound wave, right? A little bit more space between the sound waves. And once the two musicians are able to match the frequency or match the cycles of their sound waves, they're now in tune. They're playing the same note now. So different animals perceive different ranges of frequency. Humans perceive about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. Dogs have a wider range than that. Frogs can't hear very much at all. Typical human voice is right in the sweet spot of where we detect frequencies. So our brains and our ears are particularly tuned to hearing the frequency values of the human voice, which ranges from about 85 to 255 hertz. Women typically have higher hertz values, higher notes or sounds in their voice, and men have lower. And of course, kids tend to have in the higher range as well. Low frequencies actually travel better through water. So sound travels through water just like it travels through air in sound waves. So marine mammals will often have better hearing in the lower ranges. There's a concept called perfect pitch, which is the ability to recognize the frequency or the pitch of a note just out of the blue with no like tuning note or anything like that played beforehand. So somebody with perfect pitch could hear the sound of an alarm system and say that's an A, for example. They would be able to detect the exact frequency or the label that we've given that frequency. This is actually more common in speakers of tonal languages, which are languages where pitch variation distinguishes between words, languages like Vietnamese, Cantonese, Mandarin, where the same words sound with different pitch values or different frequency values can have different meanings. Amplitude is the next feature of sound, and this is the intensity of a sound stimulus. Amplitude is roughly equivalent to loudness. It's represented by the height of the sound wave, how tall the sound wave is, with higher amplitudes meaning what is a more intense stimulus or something that is perceived as louder, with lower amplitude being something that is perceived as more quiet. We measure amplitude of sound in decibels, which is the relative physical intensity of sounds. And the typical quietest sound a human can hear is 0 decibels. So decibels were created based off of the human hearing system. if something is less than 0 decibels, it doesn't mean that it doesn't create sound, it just means that humans cannot hear that sound. There's an online hearing test you can take here, but please note that it's not diagnostic. You need to go to a professional to get a diagnostic hearing test. This is just for fun. If you want to see how badly going to loud concerts has destroyed your hearing, you can check that out. Notably, loudness is a combination of the amplitude of sound waves plus our perception of the sound waves. So loudness can vary. The same sound can be loud or quiet depending on the person. So for example, or depending on the situation too. So for example, if you drop a water bottle in a silent lecture hall, that water bottle sounds a lot louder than if you drop a water bottle in a noisy lecture hall based on the relative noise around it. However, the actual amplitude or intensity of that stimulus would be the same in both of those scenarios. Complexity is the final feature of sound waves. This is the one that's most often overlooked. So complexity is how many different frequency waves make up a given sound. A pure tone is a sound with a single frequency, so it's low complexity. More complex tones have multiple frequencies. So if you look on the right here, you see this guy is playing the clarinet, and there are these many different waves, 2 through 20, that make up this very complex waveform from the clarinet. All the complex tones have a fundamental frequency. It's sort of what all of the component waveforms create and average out to, and that's the fundamental frequency. When we perceive complexity, this is called timbre, which is the quality or character of a sound. And that's how we perceive the complexity of the tone. So, for example, this image on the left that says waveform, in a tuning fork, we perceive the timbre of a tuning fork to be different from the timbre of a flute, because flute has different complexity. Same with a violin and a singer. The waveforms, the complex waveforms all look different. And that sounds different to us. That gives these instruments the characteristic sound. That's complexity and timbre. So just to sum this up, there are 3 properties of sound waves: frequency, amplitude, and complexity. And then our perception of these 3 properties of sound waves are pitch, perception, and timbre. Frequency is the rate at which a sound wave cycles per second, so hertz values. Amplitude is the intensity of sound measured in decibels, and that's how high or low the wave is, the sound wave is. And then complexity is how many different frequencies create one single sound. There are additional subjective properties of sound. In language, we often hear variations on a sound as having the same meaning. So the same word in different accents still has the same meaning. For example, in Minnesota, they say bag, and then in my Midwestern English, I say bag. And I perceive those 2 words, although they sound quite different, as being the same, having the same meaning. Language and music are processed differently than other types of sounds. So the door closing has, the sound of a door closing has a certain meaning, but language and music need additional processing because they have complex meaning. Language and music are both used for communication. They contain many, many pieces of information in very short periods of time and require quick and efficient and rather expert processing. Speech and music, or language and music, are lateralized. So as I mentioned before, language is lateralized to the left side of the brain, music is lateralized to the right side of the brain, and this is typically the case, and I'll get into that later. This is in the average brain. Most people's brains are lateralized in this way. As well, humans have a really large capacity for both language and music, and there's a good deal of evidence that suggests our brains have evolved to have a large capacity for acquiring language and music. So section 2, functional anatomy of the auditory system. We're going to go into the pathway of sound, but roughly sound waves are collected by the ears, and then transferred through the ear, through several parts of the ear and the inner ear, and this turns sound waves into mechanical energy, and then turns the mechanical energy into neural signals. These neural signals travel through the brain stem to the auditory cortex and to different regions of the auditory cortex. The brain systems for sound processing are closely related to the brain systems for sound production. And we'll get into that in a bit. This is an overview of the processing of sound in the ear. So we have the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. In the outer ear, sound waves are caught by the pinna, which is this outer part of this fleshy outer part of your ear, and the external ear canal, and these sort of act as a funnel and funnel the sound into your in toward your ear. The external ear canal amplifies the sound and directs it to the eardrum. The eardrum vibrates, so it's literally like a drum in the sense that it vibrates according to the frequency of the sound waves that are coming in, and the middle ear catches those sound waves. So the middle ear detects the vibration frequencies of the eardrum. The middle ear is actually a chamber, and it's filled with air. And inside are these three tiny little bones that have official names, but they also sort of look like a hammer, an anvil, and a stirrup. So often they're called that. So these little bones called ossicles, tiny little fragile bones, connect the eardrum to an opening in the cochlea of the inner ear. So if you've heard of cochlear implants, cochlear implants are trying to replicate the cochlea. Cochlea is kind of extremely important part of hearing. And the ossicles amplify the vibrations in the eardrum to make the sound more sensitive for the cochlea. So moving on to the inner ear is really where all the action happens in terms of sensory reception in the auditory system. This contains the cochlea, which means snail. It also means something like screw in Greek, because it's sort of snail-shaped and it's maybe like twists around like a screw. This contains the auditory receptor cells. So the outer ear and the middle ear have really just been funneling the sound and amplifying the sound in order to get to the inner ear where actual sensory reception is happening. The cochlea is filled with fluid compartments, and these compartments are separated by the basilar membrane. Embedded in the basilar membrane are hair cells, and at the tip of the hair cells are cilia. Cilia of the outer hair cells are in contact with the tectorial membrane, and vibrations cause these membranes to bend, which stimulates the cilia at the top of the hair cells, or the tips of the hair cells. There are two types of hair cells. Both are connected to the basilar membrane. There are outer and inner hair cells. Outer hair cells are also attached to the tectorial membrane. They contract or relax to change the stiffness of the tectorial membrane, and the inner hair cells are loosely touching the tectorial membrane, but they're not connected. So the cochlear fluid flows based on vibrations that have come from the outer and middle ear. The basilar membranes and tectorial membranes fluctuate. This stimulates the hair cells, the cilia on the hair cells, which moves the hair cells. This creates depolarization in the cells, which we know creates action potential. So this is what creates the nerve impulses, is this flow of the fluid, stimulates the hair cells, moves them around, and creates nerve impulses. Different frequencies can actually cause different responsiveness in different parts of the basilar membrane. So this is how our brain encodes different frequencies, which, if you remember, is something like pitch. So different notes or different tones, high and low notes. Higher frequencies or higher notes, tones cause more resonance at the base of the cochlea. So this is, you can see down in the uncoiled image of the cochlea, in the like really highest range of what we can hear. 20,000 is at the base of the cochlea. 20,000 hertz is at the base of the cochlea. It's sort of narrow and thick in this region. And then lower frequencies are picked up more in the apex or the top of the cochlea, and it's kind of thin and wide in this region. The pathway from the ear to the auditory cortex is rather complex. I'm going to give you a more simplified version than the book gives you. I don't expect you to know every single detail, but just know the general pathways. So within the inner ear, the inner hair cells synapse with bipolar cells. If you remember, bipolar cells are also in the retina of the visual system. So we see bipolar cells kind of showing up in two different sensory systems. Bipolar cell axons bunch together and create the auditory nerve, which is also known as the cochlear nerve. Part of this auditory nerve actually branches off and forms the auditory vestibular nerve as well, which is responsible for balance and hearing. So if you've ever heard of someone having like an inner ear disorder and it gives them vertigo or difficulty with balance, this is why it's the inner ear is associated as well with the vestibular system. The auditory nerve projects to both the same side of the brain and the other side of the brain. So for example, the auditory nerve that's coming out of the left ear is going to project to the left side of the brain. It's also going to send some projections to the right side of the brain. Same with the right auditory nerve. It's going to project both to the right side of the brain and then send some projections to the left side of the brain as well, so that auditory information is being processed. Auditory information from each ear is being processed on both sides of the brain. Okay, so the auditory nerve goes through the hindbrain. The auditory information goes to the midbrain then, and then to the thalamus, specifically to the medial geniculate nucleus, and then it goes to the auditory cortex. So we're seeing some similarities between the visual system and the auditory system. The visual information, you probably remember, had rather complex pathways, but also went through the thalamus to a different nucleus in the thalamus, and then went to the visual cortex. Similarly, auditory information goes through the thalamus and the auditory cortex. Within the auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe, so auditory cortex is temporal lobe on both sides of the brain. Primary auditory cortex, also known as A1, is surrounded by the secondary auditory cortex, known as A2. For right-handed and left-handed people, there can actually be differences in the lateralization of the brain. Lateralization of function is when a function is located primarily on one side of the brain versus the other, and this is the case for both language and music. So for most right-handed people, which is the majority of the population, Wernicke's area is part of the secondary auditory cortex on the left side of the brain, and the corresponding area on the right side of the brain specializes in analyzing music. However, for 15% of people who are left-handed, this hemispheric asymmetry is flipped. So for 15% of lefties, the Wernicke's area, which you remember is a language area, is on the right side of the brain, and area specializing in analyzing music is on the left side of the brain. For 15 additional percent of lefties, language function of the Wernicke's area is actually bilateral, so they have language functions on both sides of the brain. For the remaining 70% of lefties, they have lateralization similar to right-handed people. Wernicke's area is on the left side, music analysis is on the right side.